What's your opinion? This quote, can't feed them, don't breed them. I always took the saying to mean if you know you can't afford a child, do not purposefully bring one into the world. I understand the importance of all the but what if something goes wrong after and not every pregnancy baby is wanted arguments, but if you right now are unable to take care of a child adequately, do not have one. Oh wow. Read through a lot of the comments, and I have to say, I never thought of kids, but of pets. I think mine eat better than I do, and I am pretty meticulous. So, story time. I had a barn, and people dump cats at barns. My rule was, if you show up here, you get spayed neutered, you get shots, you get food and water, you get shelter, and you get attention. Well, this one cat showed up, with 2 kittens. She was so skinny, we didn't realize she was pregnant. We already had 2 barn cats, now we were up to 5, and she had a litter of 6. So we're up to 11. I rounded them up. Unfortunately my vet gave me volume discounts, so we got most of them squared away, but there was one I could not catch on that day. She ran off, and returned weeks later. Yes, pregnant. She was young and had a small litter, and we were up to 16. Nailed them all with the spay neuter shots deal. I only feed top quality, so holy crap, I didn't breed any of them, but they had their own ideas. Found homes for most, took care of the rest. You're freaking amazing. I hope you know that. People who treat animals like this are pure gold. I wish you all the luck and happiness in this world. I was the result of someone breeding me into the world and feeding me, but even as a kid, I had very few clothes and other basic necessities. I was one of the poorest kids in my school, living as a child, forced to wear the same clothes almost daily while you see other children having so much more than you is not a happy life to live, no matter how many justifications one can try to find. It's for that reason I refuse to allow my future children to suffer in a similar fashion. Same. I'm going the extreme route of not having any kids. Some months, unexpected expenses mean I can barely make ends meet. I can't imagine how hard it would be with a tiny human involved in the mix. People's life circumstances can change very quickly. My dad had a decent enough job and was able to provide for us. He had bought a house, paid for health insurance, good food on the table. One September he went to the hospital for some minor chest pains. He was dead by December from lung cancer. He was in his mid-30s. My mom with us 5 kids would become one of the poster women for can't feed them, don't breed them, but she could feed us. Until our dad died. When I bring this up, people bend over backwards to be like, oh, I didn't mean your mom, I meant, insert exaggerated stereotype here, and how do you know the same thing didn't happen to them? When you see a woman in the grocery store and you judge her for using food stamps and having 4 kids hanging off her cart, how do you know she didn't watch her husband die? You don't. So back off. Also, on an ideological standpoint, it is ridiculous that 2 people working full-time can't afford to have 1 or 2 kids, but up until recently that was the position my husband and I were in, and we were making well over minimum wage. I never wanted kids, but I wouldn't judge someone for having one even if their finances aren't in perfect order. Reproduction is one of our strongest impulses as a species. It's different when you have a ton of kids, but considering it's extremely natural for people to want to have a child, I don't think it's right to take that away from someone just because they don't make as much money as we think they should be. On a financial side, it does suck to pay for other people's bad decisions, but support and education is how the generational poverty gets broken. If a woman decides to have 15 babies to mooch out of the system, I probably would not like her as a person, and there would be an argument about whether or not she should even have custody of those kids. But I would want those babies to have a chance at a stable life. I want those babies to be able to have a shot at a good education and a good career. Yes, that means more taxes go to social safety nets, but it's better than the alternative of starving kids and inescapable poverty. I am in a similar situation. We planned for a kid, not for a freaking pandemic. Thank God we saved a lot of money. Agreed, but access to abortion and contraception seems to be the bigger issue here. People are going to have sex. We can't and shouldn't try to control that, but we can and should try to make options accessible to people. I think it's safe to say that most women do want their children to be safe and healthy, but unfortunately it doesn't always work out that way. We're so quick to judge people for things that are so often out of their control, and I find that very frustrating. My taxes pay for the fire department to come save your home even though you accidentally left the stove on and caused the fire. No one will ever say, well, if you can't guarantee your house won't catch fire, then you shouldn't buy a house, because we all know that bad things happen, and that's why we have services to help people out of situations beyond their control. I don't understand why services like abortions and education and products like contraception aren't available to women who need and want them. But we have no issue with our taxes going towards emergency services and other types of infrastructure that are needed for all the other mistakes and accidents that happen in our lives. As with most bumper sticker length wisdom, it ignores reality. I appreciate the sentiment of if you can't afford kids, don't have them, but life can change at the drop of a hat. How many people got pregnant 18 months ago, had a roof over their heads and decent jobs? They were ready to start a family. Now, they are unemployed because they lost their job due to COVID, and the only reason they haven't been kicked out of their house apartment is because of the temporary ban on kicking people out. Or, how many people lost a spouse due to an unexpected illness or an accident and are now single parents that cannot afford the kid they had? So, it is easy to say if you can't afford a kid, don't have one. But it is also easy to go from being able to afford one to not being able to afford one by one stroke of bad luck. So, how about instead of judging people, we just freaking help them and treat them like human beings? Having kids is not something people should do without having a good plan. I see too many people getting kids that are unfit to take care of themselves, much less a kid. Same applies to people getting animals. That doesn't have to be financial. There are enough people who are financial fluid enough to care for 5 little humans but couldn't handle it based on their emotional level. Free no question birth control. No parental say needed. People are going to have sex, drunk or sober. When you're frisky you aren't in peak decision making mode. At least make baby control easy. I'd be fine with this viewpoint if it was always coupled with strong advocacy for comprehensive sex education and access to birth control contraceptives. In an ideal society, every child would be a wanted and cared for child. I'm not fine with it as a way to shame people after the fact or to argue against social safety nets. It's also interesting to note that when more people begin following this advice, there are far more articles asking why the birth rate is so low than why average wages are so insufficient for raising a family. I feel like it goes for a lot more than kids or animals. It's very similar to if you can't buy it twice, you can't afford it. Since you asked, anyone that can sum up a major social problem on one clever line is woefully undereducated on the issue. It's awful. We've created a society where a handful of people have nearly all the resources. Most of us can't really afford kids. This is really a way to deflect attention from this economic inequality. It sounds wise, but it's almost always used by someone who is prejudiced against some other group. I most often hear it from white racists about poor African Americans or Latinos. Secondarily, I hear it from right-wing people who are against abortion and birth control, but resent having to pay for taxes to fund services for children and families. Usually breed is applied to animals. Part of the implicit message of this statement is that people who the speaker has contempt for are more animal than human. The concept of can't feed them shouldn't exist in America, given our wealth and the fact we are one of the most overweight countries that wastes the most food. Oh, and of course the fact that our country was founded on Christian values and feeding the poor is what Jesus would do. When poor people have a kid, it gets called breeding. When rich people have a kid, it gets called starting a family. Also, when poor people have kids, it isn't because they are unaware that they're poor. There are a lot of reasons why poor people have more kids. Lack of proper education and lack of access to contraception are some of the biggest ones. I mean, I am not about to try and have a kid I can't afford. And there are some people whose procreation habits I disagree with. But those are my choices and personal opinions that have frick all to do with others. You want to talk policy, comprehensive sex education, easy and affordable birth control, and abortion access are what reduce unwanted pregnancies and unplanned parenthoods. As to folks struggling to afford children, it has a lot to do with suckers struggling to afford surviving at this point. Fix income inequality, then we can talk about the choice of having kids people can't afford. But ultimately, I'm still in favor of setting up society to support innocent children of irresponsible parents, rather than punish children for parental actions outside of the children's control. I mean, that's great and all, but there's a huge gap in education both around sex and around finances. I agree, if you understand your financial situation and you choose to get pregnant without a plan to support that child, you've essentially planned neglect. That's not cool, but if the pregnancy isn't planned, you still have to respect the right to choose. It should prompt the parents who choose to keep that pregnancy to find a way to plan to support it. And I know plenty of people who don't understand basic finance, and don't understand why they're always struggling. These are the people that think getting involved in an MLM is a real job, or they bought too much car and now they're stuck in it. Go to our personnel finance, you'll see these stories all day long. Usually the advice they need is super simple, but the problem is, these scenarios don't just happen on the flip of a switch. They take time to develop, and in the meantime, they may have a kid without fully understanding how it will impact their finances. Not even bad financial decisions. As we find out every so often, the economy can take people's financial plans and expectations and turn them upside down, and not everybody can survive that. I agree. I know there's a stigma attached to legalizing abortions, but honestly some people aren't cut out to be parents. And I mean good parents, not just people who just feed, clothe, shelter, and educate you and think you owe them your existence for them doing their duty. Totally agree. Too many idiots have kids because they want them, with no mind to what the kid might say on the matter if they are dragged into the world to be poor, malnourished, bullied and more. Case in point, a moron I know has no savings to his name, no steady job, no nothing, but because his wife is desperate for babies, they went through IVF, not being able to afford it, and have been saddled with twins. They're about to lose the house, they're up to their eyeballs in debt, and the kids are going to suffer for it because the wife is a raging narc and the husband is an idiot. But who cares about that? They had kids, like, the only reason for living s. I agree to a certain level, but people's circumstances change. If you can't afford your kid from the moment you decide to have one, that's a bad decision, no way around it. If you can but outside controls force you into an unfortunate situation, it's completely different. There's no black and white answer. Imo actually wanting to be a parent and taking pride in raising someone with all of your love and support is far more important than how much money you make. The complexity of life today means you just can't hunt or gather anymore, so society takes on the role of mother-father for those unable to feed themselves. It is the consequence of everything being owned by someone or something. I really don't know what else we can do. Perhaps offer incentives for permanent birth control. I remember years ago India offered a free vasectomy plus a radio to young men to those willing to do it. The world went nuts, calling it genocide of the poor. I think conservative. Which then reminds me that conservatives also want kids to have unwanted kids by promoting abstinence-only education. Don't want to let you abort an unwanted child, even in instances of rape, and then don't want to support the poor in any way whatsoever. While I agree that people should be intelligent about large life decisions, I think as a society, we really need to properly educate everyone, including eradication of abstinence-only and other idiotic ideas. Education will fix humanity. We need to be putting a whole lot more effort into that. People who say stupid crap like that forget that we live in a society where sex education is pathetic, abortion access is minimal, and poverty can happen to anyone at the drop of a hat. Really, it depends on who that's being quoted to. Someone living in a poor area with no social security net, access to contraception and education, then that's kinda douche. Long-term relatively stable couple having one kid but on the lower end, still douche. Parents down on their luck and need help after COVID loss, douche. sibling, relative, etc. who can't care for themselves, lives in parents' basement, and doesn't help out, works minimum wage and is a single parent of a mob while actively try for more then begs you for money, totally justified and holds true. I had a professor who drove an unnecessarily large pickup truck. Once in a meeting, another professor made a friendly jibe about his carbon footprint. My professor pointed out that while he had one kid, the other professor had 3 and that therefore he could drive dozens of pickup trucks and still have the smaller footprint. You can target a community economically and then shame them for not being able to afford their next generation. Genocide by economic policies. The quote comes from the idea that actions are just a result of personal decision. The problem is that it obfuscates the issue that external factors have a big effect on the outcome of a person's life. People act predictable in situations. I think it's a good quote when it comes to parenting. If you can't afford to bring a child into this world, don't. You'll just end up giving them a bad life. Reading through the comments, I'd say this quote shouldn't really be taken as an offense to people who were struck by disaster and struggled afterwards. This is something you say to the kinds of idiots who can barely pay their rent and just won't stop fricking without condoms. The kinds of people who go 9 and counting. Every one of them is a miracle. No, Susan. Every one of them is stuck in a nightmare of your making. Besides, we're already overpopulated, so what exactly are you achieving by crapping out enough offspring to form a band plus techies and have the rest of them be groupies? Usually it's buttholes that say this. People's circumstances change. If a father or mother gets cancer and dies and the family's financial situation changes drastically, should they kill off a couple kids? I heard someone say this about a woman who came into hard times. I almost decked them. If you can't afford food for your pets or animals on farm, then don't have it. They will just suffer hunger. And if you can't afford food, you can't afford medical stuff for your pet. I strongly agree with the quote. It's ugly, but life can get so ugly too. Forget money, forget everything. Having a kid is a responsibility that has no expiration date. If you are 80 and your kid is 50, that 50-year-old kid is still going to blame you for all his life's problems. I look around me and I see that most people are victims of bad childhoods, but still they continue the cycle and overpopulate the planet. It's baffling to me. I consider myself to be pretty liberal and try and understand that some poorer families may not have been that way before the kids were born. Medical debt, disability, etc. can all bankrupt a family pretty quickly. That being said, I knew a family with 11 kids who were always trying for more. They had very little money and relied on local churches for clothes and food. Their kids weren't schooled or given any one-on-one time because the parents were always so busy trying to make ends meet. I can't understand how you can look at 11 hungry faces around you every day and think that you should try and make it 12. Couldn't agree more with it. Having kids should be like getting a mortgage. You have to prove you can provide for them without state intervention. Should be law. Instead, we reward horrible parenting and decision making with free government money at every turn. It's gross. I was married when I birthed my kids. Through a series of unfortunate events, I'm divorced and with them full time, on government assistance in order to nourish their bodies. People try to backtrack. Oh, we don't mean your situation. But yes, you freaking do. 50% of marriages end in divorce. I knew that going into my marriage. I knew that while pregnant with my children. Should I have given my children to their other parent, who doesn't want them, but makes more money? Maybe then they wouldn't have food stamps to eat. Should I ignore the needs of my medically complicated child and work more? Should I put him in the equivalent of a nursing home for children? Yes, those places do exist. Should I have had an abortion when I was pregnant with my second child, knowing I was bringing a child with disabilities into the world, just in case I ended up divorced and would need to work? There's no easy answer, and the vast majority of us are 1 or 2 unfortunate situations away from the welfare office. A moral dilemma that one should have with themselves that should not be dictated, monitored or enforced by some third party, but it's cool if to inform. I think it entirely misses the point. In other words, I've never heard that phrase uttered in a context where it was relevant to someone considering whether or not to have children. It is always weaponized against poor families who already have children who are seeking assistance. That makes it self-righteous patronization that helps people feel better about not being poor instead of useful advice. Welfare queens popping out babies to collect government benefits certainly exist, but it's mostly just a conservative boogeyman that has been vastly overstated to justify screwing over millions of people living in poverty. I agree with it. I was born to parents that had me on accident and couldn't afford me. My life was heck. It was very clear that I wasn't wanted and none of my needs were ever met. Nobody thinks about the children of parents who can't afford them. But we didn't deserve this life of poverty. I wish my parents wore a condom. They were stupid and reckless. I'm not going to give my own opinion, but I have heard that as countries become more developed, their fertility rate decreases. Going through some articles, I can't prove if they're trustworthy, but they seem legit and all say similar info. They list these explanations: access to education and opportunities for women, access to contraceptives, lower mortality rates, and sources of income. Not my arguments, but I do have some commentary. When women gain an education and are able to make a living, they are able to support themselves and don't have to get married to get money. I assume that declining sexist ideology can also be included here. Women are seen less as a baby-making roulette of getting that one male to support the family. I'm disappointed that the articles barely expand on this, but one did mention about women choosing to have babies later in life, which slows down population growth. Ironically, there's also a fertility gap in the US where the average fertility is less than how many babies on average people actually want. Contraceptives, and sex education and birth control, prevents accidental pregnancy. A lot of other comments seem to talk about this, so I don't really have much else to say. Although, I feel like they assume that getting too many babies is always an accident. When is it not an accident? Or a product of sexism? Infant mortality rates. In developed countries, it is much easier for cure a sick baby and the chances for sickness is lower. In underdeveloped or developing countries, having a one or a few children is risky. If those children die, then it's over, assuming they can't or won't make more babies. For example, too old or not worth raising another. Not stated in the articles, but I think the argument can be extended to say that they believe that more babies is a lot of financial strain. But if they sacrifice themselves for the children, hopefully one can live and get a stable income. Very opposite to the theory in the other comments. Which is better? I have no clue. I personally think that focusing heavily on less children is better, but that's a perspective of a developed country's citizen. In places where income doesn't heavily rely on education, that is, labor, having more children means increased income. This can be a short-term gain, but it can also work in the long run. When the parents are too old to work, they can be supported by their children. Extended families can also pitch in so that there's a giant network of people providing for each other. I speculate that this may be one reason why some cultures value family very strongly and expect family members to help each other out. As a closing note, the average fertility rate has been going down globally and might even pose the problem of declining populations already present in some countries. My wife and I both worked in social services in the 90s. We dealt with many people in need, including single moms. I recall one mom who was homeless and fleeing an abusive spouse in a short school bus with her kids. Unfortunately, some poverty in the US, at least, has become generational. No aspirations of going to school or getting a good job or pursuing some life's passion. It's just moms having kids who then similarly have kids and get signed up for government assistance. That quote might on the surface be a decent rule of thumb, but there are some in our society who have made living off the government their primary source of income. I'll get downvoted into oblivion for contradicting the Reddit hive mind, but I'm not against this. I'm also very much for universal access to contraceptives. If a woman at 16 wants to get her tubes tied, let her do it. It shouldn't require you having to be married with 2 kids in order to have such effective birth control. I'm even fine with paying school taxes despite not having children. I'm not fine with paying for Betty Jo's gaggle of 12 neglected children, then also having my tax dollars go to her legal defense so she can try to keep the children she's been neglecting. I'm perfectly fine with my tax dollars helping parents who are actively engaged in their child's life and working to cultivate them into productive members of society. I mean, heck, If you own so many dogs that you can't adequately take care of them, we take them away. Swap dogs out with children and we just throw money at them and cross our fingers they're going to use it on the child. A very important point to understand is that the Betty Joes are such a tiny minority that they are barely worth considering when designing food aid security systems for children from impoverished families. Investing into those kids as a society is one of the most effective ways to ensure that they do not end up like their parents. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.